The description for the classic palm glove pattern may say elegant, but since it's nearly Halloween, I thought it needed a furry, creepy creature makeover. In this pattern hack, we're going to be modifying the pattern, sewing with faux fur, and giving our gloves a manicure. Let's get started. For this project, you're going to need tracing paper, a ruler, preferably gridded for adding seam allowances, a sharp pencil or extra fine tip marker for tracing your pattern, paper scissors and fabric scissors or rotary cutter, masking tape, a tracing marker or chalk. I used a fine tip marker for precision, but test whatever you choose on a scrap of fabric to be sure it shows up clearly and doesn't bleed or stain. An awl or similar pointed tool for poking holes in your pattern, stretchy spandex fabric for the palms, stretchy faux fur or novelty chenille, contrast fabric or leather for adding paw pads, this one's optional, fake nails, nail polish, paper or plastic to protect your work surface, scrap tracing paper or a plastic bag for texturizing your nail art, E6000 or similar glue, and of course, the classic palm glove pattern and instructions. The first thing we need to do is make some changes to our pattern so that we can use different fabrics on the front and back of the hand. Grab some tracing paper and lay it over your pattern. Draw a solid line where the fold line is, which will now be a seam. Trace everything on the thumb side of your solid line. Make sure you also trace all of the alignment dots and notches, as well as your dog's arrows. It's also really helpful to add pattern labels at this point so you know what the modification is for and how many pieces to cut if you want to use the pattern in the future. Add a second line 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters to the outside of the line formerly known as your fold, and that's going to be your seam allowance. For each glove, you'll cut one of these halves from furry fabric with no thumb hole, and one from the non-furry fabric with a thumb hole. Repeat this process for the thumb. Once again, each glove will have half a thumb from the furry fabric and half from the non-furry spandex. For each of these pieces, you want to make sure that you flip one side over so that they're mirrored and make up a full, complete piece. You don't need to make any changes to the gussets pattern, but you can trace a copy if you don't want to cut into your original, which is actually generally a really good habit to do with your patterns. I happen to have lots of copies. Before you start marking the fabric, it's also helpful to poke through your alignment dots with a sharp tool like an awl. When laying out your fabric, it's important to find the direction of greatest stretch. This is marked dogs on your pattern. Some fabrics stretch much less or not at all in one direction, and unlike woven fabrics and their grain lines, it's not always the same from one type of fabric to another. So we want to make sure that the stretch goes in the direction that needs it most when the garment is worn. In my case, the stretch runs horizontally on my fabric, so I've laid out the arrows on my dog's line horizontally. I've also placed the faux fur fabric wrong side up so that the fuzzy side doesn't get in my way while I'm tracing. I always cut my glove pieces one at a time from a single layer of fabric for precision. Trace around the pattern piece and carefully mark all of the alignment marks. When you remove the pattern piece, check that your alignment marks are visible, and you may want to draw in the dotted cut marks between the fingers. Don't cut them right away though. Cut the piece out exactly on the tracing lines. Trace and cut all of your pieces using this method. The gusset pieces should be cut from the non-furry fabric. Since the gusset pieces are so small and similar, I like to leave them attached until I'm ready to use each one. I also like to mark which end is which with a little note on some masking tape. When you're ready to sew the gloves, begin by sewing the two halves of your thumb together along your new center seam, using the 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter seam allowance and a straight stitch. And then you're going to do the same for your main glove pieces. Some furry bits will probably try to escape at the sides, so stitch slowly and tuck them back into the inside as you sew. This will help you keep your stitching accurate, and it'll make your paws look fuller and fluffier at the seams. From there, sew everything as described in the pattern instructions. The only difference is that you'll need to continue tucking the fur to the inside. In some of the tighter spots, it can be tough to do this with just your fingers, so a poking tool like an awl or a point turner can be really helpful here. And it'll keep your fingers safely away from the needle. Whenever you are adjusting these fiddly spots with your fingers, try to get in the habit of taking your foot off of the pedal. Gonna take this thumb and we're gonna wiggle it through the thumb hole, just like so, and line up the seam with the alignment mark up at the top of the thumb hole. And I'm grabbing a pin here just to keep that from wiggling around. And then if you want to, you can also find the bottom of your thumb hole and tuck a little pin in there. So now everything is facing the right direction. Whee! Quick note, of course, I immediately, after completing this project and tutorial, thought of an even better modification for this pattern to eliminate the gap between the center seam and the thumb. This would also make the thumb insertion a little bit easier to sew, so I'm going to write that up in a separate post. But for now, we're going to stick with what I did here. Setting in the thumb can be a bit tricky with all of that fuzz in the way, so don't be afraid to touch it up with some hand stitching if you're falling off the edge of the seam allowance with the machine. And now that your glove is all sewn together, here's where you get to go wild. I had a bunch of tiny leather scraps hanging around, but you could use a contrast color spandex fabric, faux leather, or even a thin craft foam. I trimmed my leather into the shapes I thought would look best and glued them in place with E6000, though this turned out to be maybe not the ideal glue for this application since some of the pieces did start lifting away and had to be re-glued later. When I'm using E6000, especially when applying small pieces, I like to squeeze a small amount of glue onto a scrap of cardboard first and apply it with a toothpick. That way I can close up the tube and prevent leaks or contamination instead of applying the glue directly from the tube. Next up, claws. I grabbed some plain nail tips from my stash and gave my glove some fancy nail art. For most of the fingers, I used the largest size nail tip that I had, partly for the biggest, scariest claw effect, and partly because the bigger sizes don't really fit my actual hands, and they may as well not go to waste. I trimmed away some of the fur in the nail bed area as close as I could to the fabric without damaging its structure. I then used the E6000 again to glue those suckers down. I applied the nails with the glove flat on the table, but if you want more control over which way your claws end up pointing, I'd recommend putting the glove on your hand or a model to do this. Once the glue had dried enough to handle the claws, I trimmed and filed them to shape and applied black nail polish to both sides of the nail. I let this dry, added a second coat of black to the top of the nail, let that dry, and then went to town with some fun gold texture. For this, I crinkled up a little piece of plastic shopping bag and smooshed it in a little puddle of gold polish that I poured out onto a scrap surface. Then I lightly dabbed the gold over the black polish until my claws were sufficiently marbled. Let all this dry, seal it with a clear top coat if you want, and then you're done. Try on your creature paw and make goofy faces. This step is very important. Don't skip this one. Well, that's it for this one, my fabulous friends. But don't forget to check out my other videos, as well as my blog at palmpatterns.com/blog for more tips, tricks, tutorials, and news about future patterns. We'll see you next time.